Okay, boys and girls, here's our first listening and learning on YouTube. I'm going to continue our westward expansion listening and learning unit. You know that we've read about a lot of things about how the Americans were traveling across the country and starting to go out west and all of the different ways that they traveled across. And one way that we're going to talk about today is when they started building railroads. And we know up until this point, they mainly used animals, horses and oxen and whatnot, to carry their things across. So building a railroad was a huge, huge deal. They were able to travel much, much more easily, but it was a lot of work getting a railroad built. So you know that my big flip book is huge with the pictures, so it's not going to be super easy to get the pictures on here, but I'm going to do my best. And be patient with me, okay? All right, so all right, so here's a picture of the locomotive. And now I'll read you the section on that. The locomotive is a machine at the front of the train that pulls all the other cars along the track. Before the locomotive was invented, several horses pulled a car or wagon along the rails, but the locomotive had the power of many horses in a single machine. That's why some people gave it the name iron horse. Because the locomotive was made of the type of metal called iron, and it had the power of many horses to pull the train cars. How did the locomotive work? Well, at the heart of the locomotive was a steam engine. The locomotive steam engine was similar to the steam engine used in Fulton's steamboat. Remember how much faster the steamboat traveled. A coal or wood-burning furnace produced steam, which powered the locomotive. Okay, now let's get into our next section. All right, so this section's called Working on the Transcontinental Railroad. All right, and here's our newest picture. Okay, my name is Michael, and this is a photo of my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, Ling Wei. He helped to build the Transcontinental Railroad. That's a pretty long word, but it's easy to understand if you split it into parts. The first part of the word is trans, which means across, and the second part of the word is continental. So my ancestor, Ling Wei, helped build a part of the railroad that goes across the continental United States, or from the East Coast to the West Coast. Okay, so his great-great-great-great-great-grandfather helped to build it. And we know that family that lived in the past is called our ancestors. Okay. Here's a map of the United States. Let's see if I can get it all in there. Ling Wei began working on the railroad in 1863. By that time, there were many railroads in the United States, but they mostly went from the northeast to the southeast, or from eastern cities like Baltimore to cities in the Midwest like Omaha, Nebraska. It was cheaper, more comfortable, more convenient for people to travel by rail than to travel by canal or wagon. It was faster, too. But before the Transcontinental Railroad, people could only travel to the west by wagon or horse, or by boat on a river or canal, and the going was slow, just like we talked about with the Oregon Trail, right? The going was very, very slow. So a train, so much faster. You guys can probably hear Frozen in the background. Eli's watching Frozen right now. I'm probably going to get copyrighted. Okay, so here we have some workers working. Because the iron horse was faster, cheaper, and more comfortable and more convenient, many people thought it would be a great idea to have a railroad track that spanned the entire United States. My great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, Ling Wei, helped to lay those tracks that connected settlers in the Midwest near the Missouri River to settlers in Sacramento, California, all the way to the West Coast. How many people can say that about one of their ancestors? Okay. Bear with me in my big book. All right. So it might be a little bit difficult to see. Okay, it took two separate rail companies to build the Transcontinental Railroad, the Union Pacific Railroad and the Central Pacific Railroad. The Union Pacific Railroad Company started building from Omaha, Nebraska, and laid its tracks going west. The Central Pacific Railroad Company started building from San Francisco, California, and laid its tracks going east. At first, the two companies were competing against each other to see who could lay the most track. The U.S. government paid each company for every mile of track it laid. Okay, there's a map for each company. We read that. In the end, the government told them they had to work together and join their tracks. Okay, that made the most sense. They could meet in the middle, right? Most of the laborers who laid the track for the Union Pacific Railroad were Irish immigrants. My ancestor Ling Wei worked for the Central Pacific Railroad. Like many other Chinese immigrants during the 1800s, Ling Wei had settled in California. He and other Chinese immigrants, as well as other immigrants from all over the world, came from the United States because of the promise of gold and a better life. When people realized that mountains of gold they had heard about were a myth, they had to find some other way to survive. So many Chinese immigrants worked on the western portion of the railroad, while Irish immigrants worked on the eastern section. These workers laid tracks through the mountains, across rivers, and deserts in the United States. Okay, so they had also come to California just as our settlers on the East Coast came to California because they were hoping to find gold. We know that that was a very challenging thing to do. Okay. The Transcontinental Railroad took 6 years to build, and my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather Ling Wei kept journals for all those years. Here's my favorite journal entry. Okay, so this was written by his great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. May 10th, 1869, Promontory Point, Utah. Only 100 feet left to lay. That's what I thought of first thing this morning. After several years of hard work, long hours, and little wages, 100 feet of track is all there was left to complete the Transcontinental Railroad today. Now it is hard to believe the work is complete. Despite the hardship I endured, I feel proud of my work. I think everyone today wanted to share in that sentiment. Wherever I look, people tried to lend a hand in finishing the track. Men that were just passing through Utah to deliver goods stopped to throw dirt on the ties or to drive a spike in the ground. Even the presidents of the Central Pacific Railroad and the Union Pacific Railroad took turns driving the last spike into the rails. It was a spike made of gold to mark the special occasion. They both missed on their first try, and all of us workers laughed. It was not as easy as we made it look. In fact, it was very difficult. Okay, so when the presidents of the company tried to hammer it in, they had a hard time. So the workers thought it was funny because they'd done it so often. Day in and out, we swung those heavy hammers, driving the sharp spikes that held the wooden ties together into the solid ground. We carried heavy wooden ties in the hottest weather you can imagine. The worst days by far were those spent drilling tunnels into the Sierra Nevada mountains. These tunnels had to be big enough for locomotive trains to pass through. First, the stone had to be blasted with dynamite. Then we went in and started shaping the tunnel. No matter how hard we worked to cut into the stone, we would only move a few inches a day. I can still remember how tired my arms felt at the end of those days. It seemed like there was no end of sight, and we'd never reach the other side of the mountains. Other days were filled with worry as we worked through land where Indian tribes were still powerful. They did not like us building through land that had been their home for many hundreds of years. I do not know how the railroad will change life for them. For settlers and their families on the West Coast, I think the Transcontinental Railroad would change lives a great deal. Trains will provide faster and cheaper method of transportation. That means a way of getting around, right? It's going to be much quicker, and it's not going to be as expensive. People on the East Coast will now be able to get goods from the West, and people in the West Coast can now get goods from the East more easily. Travel for people who can afford the train will be more comfortable and convenient too. Of course, many people who cannot afford train tickets will still have to use wagons for their travel. Okay, so not everyone would have been able to afford it and travel on the train. Okay, here's a picture of his grandfather working in his journal. As for us workers, we felt as much excitement as we did fatigue. Fatigue means being tired. We set the record for laying the most miles of track in one day. On that day, we worked from sunrise to sunset and laid 10 miles of track. Today, we finally finished our work. We've built a railroad that connects the east and west coasts of the United States. One day, people will talk about all the businessmen who dreamed of this and started the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroad companies. I hope they talk about my fellow workers and me too, the men who built the railroad. And we're talking about them right now, right? Okay, boys and girls, that was our first listening and learning on YouTube. I hope it went okay. I want you to be thinking about tomorrow for your journal topic. Why did they call the locomotive the Iron Horse? Have a good day, guys.